Hello everyone, and welcome to our first programming video for AP Computer Science. In this video we will do the traditional start to learning of a new programming language, and this is called the Hello World program. Of course it is just a tradition, so you could, if you've programmed before, you may have seen this, and if not, then this will be your first time making a small program. It may not be much, but it is a good start. As you can see, I have Netbeans open, so hopefully you installed the most current version of the Java JDK and the current version of Netbeans following my previous video. If you have not, please take a look at that. It should be pretty easy to install. Once you have it installed and you've opened your program, generally speaking, most of us should see something very similar to this. It may be a little different based on previous settings that I've had on older versions, but the idea is that typically there's a start page, there's on the left side some menus that keep track of the projects we may or may not make, files we may keep around, and then an output area for displaying of content that we generate. If you don't want the start page to pop up every time, which I tend not to prefer, on the right there's a little menu, a little option that says show on startup, and we can uncheck it, and so the next time around this will not be here. We can close the startup page. Before we get going, I'm going to ask you to change some settings, and this is just, I'll show you an area where a lot of settings are available and you can play around with them as you see fit. But the one that I've changed is to have a background that's darker. I prefer it that way, so if you prefer a dark background with light text as opposed to the typical white background with black or dark text, then this may be an option for you. So in the top there's a typical menu bar, and so all the way the third from the right is Tools. We're going to select the Tools menu and go all the way to the very last option called Options. And then you may start in the general area. Most of this stuff we're not going to touch. The one that there's two I'm going to focus on. The first one is fonts and colors. And where it says profile, yours may say Netbeans 5.5 or flat light or some default, or just Netbeans perhaps. And so these are different kind of default styles. We can change the coloring of pretty much everything in our editor. But really, I don't tend to play around with too much of it. The one that I'm just going to switch to is Norway Today. And again, notice it is kind of a dark blue background with light white text and yellows and oranges for key words and literals that we'll talk more about. So I've also made my font larger. So if you are curious, or if it's hard for you to see your own font, or you want to make it a little bit bigger, on the right side there's a font section. By default, it's monospace probably 16. If you hit the three dots here, we can see and choose a bigger font size, and I can always change this as we go in the future. You can always pick what you want. Again, I would not mess around too much because unfortunately some fonts are risky, even though this font does have the same kind of problem that I'm complaining about, where things like capital O's and zeros look very similar, a little too close, and lowercase l's look like ones. That is definitely a flaw of some fonts. So you could find one maybe that gets rid of that, but often other fonts do look pretty rough after looking at it for a long time. Monospaced fonts tend to be the better choices, like Courier New, things like that. So I'm sticking with this for now, just to show you. And we could change the colors of all kinds of different things and put effects. We're not going to play around too much with them, but if we wanted to, we could do that. The next thing I would ask us to do is to go to the second area, Editor, and the one I'm going to look for is a lot of different tabs. There's a lot of options. I'm going to go to the Formatting, which is the third tab in this area, so Formatting. And where it says Language, instead of all languages, because this thing can handle many different languages, we're going to go to the Java area, so we're going to choose Java from the drop-down. And then, this is kind of blank, but we're going to go from tab indents to braces. Oh wow, oh there it is. Okay, so I just had to scroll. And so something that I have that many of you may not, and this is just a preference, but I'll show you, this is what yours may look like. Same line for a lot of them. And so you'll notice that as an example, they show, and this also might be like that. Well, I don't know if that one's checked. But you'll see that when we put curly braces, and we're going to use curly braces a lot, one of the standard views or styles is to put the opening curly brace on the right side of a line and then have the left one, or the closing one on the left side. I do not care for that. I like to have the alignment of curly braces. So when we get to that point, you can make a decision. But if you prefer the way, and I'll show you what it looks like in a moment, I'm going to switch these to New Line, New Line, New Line. And other I'm going to keep, well actually let's do New Line as well. And so now notice that the open, the close, the open, you can see this dashed line, which could still be there, but now it's a little bit easier for me, in my opinion, to spot the alignments. And so I very much prefer this. The IDE will also attempt to make curly braces for you, and so it might have generate for each of these three by default. I will switch them to leave alone, mainly because sometimes when we'll see it, I don't want to make curly braces. I don't want it automatically making them for me, and I don't want to have to erase them. So these are the settings that I've played with for these, and there are actually lots of categories, so you can put more space, more white space, enter empty lines, spaces, and tabs. But so you can take time to play around with this, and if you have questions, you can just reach out to me. There are a lot of options, and we have a lot of control of things we do, but these are the ones that I think are very important for me because they make it much easier for me to read code, my own and others. And when I show you the shortcut for automatically formatting your code, it'll follow the standard that we've generated here. So mine will automatically line up curly braces whether or not I did it myself, and that's a good thing. So I'm going to click apply and then OK, or you can just click OK and it'll automatically apply it. And so we're going to be here. So now, what Netbeans, again, I mentioned, is an IDE, an integrated development environment. And the key to take away is that instead of having just loose text files that we have to compile individually, and initially that's not difficult to do if it's one file, but we might eventually have multiple files in a project, Netbeans is going to make like a folder structure for us and keep it all together. So when I grade your projects, it's much more manageable for me to just open up a folder in Netbeans and then look at your code and run it instead of having to type commands. And then it also does auto completion of errors. So if there's an error you could not fix, I can quickly spot it and read it and hopefully discover what the problem is, and we can talk about those things. So I think sticking with this environment is not necessarily the only way of doing things, but a pretty reasonable way. And so we're going to be making projects. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make one project for all the notes that I create throughout the year. And you might want to do the same thing. You can copy notes. Even though you may be watching these videos, you might want to write out the code yourself to see how it works, to run it, to play around with it. That's always a good idea. And so to make a project, and then also when you make projects for assignments, you will make individual projects for each assignment. And that's the end goal. But first I'm going to make a new project. So the file menu, there's a lot of options. New project is the first one. There's also that yellow button with the little green plus on the bar. And you may see Java with Maven, Java with Gradle, Java with Ant, and a few other options. But the idea is that the one that we're going to stick with, again, this is mainly for ease of my grading, is the third option, Java with Ant. When you select it, you should see on the right side a bunch of options. The first one is the one that we should be selecting for every project we make, Java application. And we're not going to talk about what these tools are, but they're basically tools that allow us to control how we manage our code in complex ways, and we're not going to really experience too much of it. So it is easier, in my opinion, for now to work with Java application in the Java with Ant section. So when we do that, we can click Next. It'll ask us for the name of a project. The name of the project is whatever you prefer. It is purely a folder name. It's not really tied to the Java itself, but you should give it a reasonable name, something that you want to put somewhere that you understand what it is. So for example, instead of Java application 4, I'm going to put mine as APCS underscore notes, or actually no underscore notes, underscore notes, and then HT for Holy Trinity. So this is, I know, because I have 2 other courses, sections of AP, so it's good for me to keep mine separate. Since you're taking only one AP course, you can name yours whatever you like. The next thing I'm going to do is project location. Yours might be some default reasonable location. Mine, unfortunately, remembers some old projects, so I'm going to have to change mine. I'm going to put mine in a drive that I have, so I'm going to put mine right here. And you can see I have other projects as well. So there's mine. And the last thing I'll suggest, if you see this create main class option, uncheck it, turn it off. Mainly because it's going to try to give us some default code, but I want us to write it from scratch every time until we know what it all means. And we're not there just yet, and we won't be for a little while. So it's better, in my opinion, for us to do it ourselves every time until we're all comfortable. So uncheck create main class. When I'm done, I'm going to click finish. It'll generate a project, and we should see it pop up on the left side of my screen. And there it is, and it has a little Java cup of coffee, and that's what represents it. And the little plus will open it up so we can see more details. All the projects are going to have 2 main sources. One part is not our code. The libraries is the Java core and things like that. Source packages is where our code will go. And so initially there's a default package that's grayed out. It's empty. There's no code in it, and that's perfectly reasonable. And eventually we're going to add code. So now for this project, this example is the first set of notes we're going to write It's going to be very, very simple. And so because I'm keeping all of the notes for the entire year in this project, I'm going to make what are called packages, which are like subfolders for code for different topics. So the first package we're going to make is going to be called basics. It's going to be the introductory stuff, basics of variables, basics of setting up a program, things like that. And as we get into other topics, we will make new packages. If you really feel like you need to make a new project for every single topic, that's okay, but it will require that you have many different topics. I think having it all in one project is easy so you can search through all your code if you ever have to look back. So how do we make a package or a subfolder? We're going to right-click on any of these three levels. I'm going to right-click on Default Package. Then there's a new menu, the first one. And then it's going to give us some examples. And again, there's a lot of Java files that we can make, and it generates a lot of code for us. But the one that we want is Java Package, this yellow or brown paper looking package picture. Click on it. It's going to ask for a name. Typically the standard, this is not a requirement, it's not a strict requirement, but typically the standard for most Java developers is package names are all lowercase. So I'm going to call mine basics. Right? This is for the initial code. Again, we'll make other packages as we move along. So once I'm done, notice it just tells us where it's going to be. It's going to be in the source folder and in the folder called basics. It's purely a folder. So let's go ahead and click finish. And as soon as we do that, you'll notice that default is gone. And it's not that it's destroyed or erased, but it's hidden because, generally speaking, we don't want to put content into the default package unless we absolutely have to. So we have our empty package. Now, how can we make our first Java file or code file? And what's going to happen is, similar to most content on computers, there is a file type associated with the code that we write, and it is the .java extension. So you may have seen .txt for text files or .docx for Word documents, and many different extensions for all kinds of JPEG for pictures or PNG and so on. So Java files end in .java. When they are compiled into the intermediate language called bytecode for the JVM, they are converted to .class files. And we may take a look at those later on, but generally speaking, we don't play around with those. We only work with the Java source files. So how do we make our first Java source file for our first program? We're going to right-click on this package. We're going to choose New, and then we're going to choose Java Class. Now here it's the second option, Java Class. And we're going to give it a name, just like we did before, and notice it's going to tell us it's going to be in the basics folder or the basics package. Now here's something important to recognize, the first lesson we have to know, and this is one that does directly affect the AP exam. When you make a class in Java, and we'll talk more about what that entails, the name of the class must be what we call capital case. Capital case means every word in the name is capitalized. So notice their example is new class, the N is capitalized, the C is capitalized. So if we called this supercar, it would be capital S and capital C for super and car. And no spaces either. You cannot put spaces. If I try to put a space, it's going to tell us don't do it. It's not valid. We are allowed to put an underscore, but generally speaking, that's not a Java practice. Typically, the standard, and again, standard means what professionals typically do and what most people that use Java in any meaningful way follow, mainly to minimize confusion between programmers that are working together. Underscores are not a typical Java thing for most names, so particularly for class names. So capital case, each word is capitalized. If there's only one word, that one word is capitalized. And so I'm going to rename this class, and again, this is kind of our tradition. I'm going to call this class Hello World. This is our first Java program. It's not going to do very much, but it does follow still the standard. We have to get comfortable following the standard of capital case class names. When I do this, it's going to generate some code for us, and we'll talk about what it means, and then we will fill in the final step. We create our class. Packages, notice, is no longer gray, and it creates a hello world.java file on the right. And of course, it also gave me my code that it pre-built for us, some very basic, very few lines that are meaningful. So we'll talk about what all these lines mean, and we'll go from there. I'm going to close my output for now, just so I have more space. So as I write more code, I potentially can see a little bit more. The first thing we're going to notice is the blue. I'm going to point out what these things are here and here. These are what are called comments. When we write code, typically the code is meant for the computer, and the computer does interpret whatever lines we write to do what it says. It converts it into machine language, and then it can run it when it's ready to do some action. Comments are lines that aren't really code. They're purely for human consumption. We read them, we interpret them, that's it. They're ignored by the computer. They do not care about what these things are. And so we're going to have two types of comments, and these have kind of already been made for us, so I'm going to delete them and write my own just temporarily. And so the first type of comment that we've just seen, I'm going to get rid of these and we'll fill them in, are what are called multi-line comments. Multi-line comments are comments that last multiple lines, if it's not obvious. And so the idea is that we have to kind of write it in a particular way. And a multi-line comment is pretty simple to start. You do a forward slash, an asterisk or star, and then you end it with an asterisk and a forward slash. So I'm going to hit enter and it's going to automatically complete it for me. And so notice a multi-line comment, what it says is anything between the open and close slash star or star slash is considered comments and is ignored by the computer. You'll know because in my coloring, in my scheme, they'll turn this kind of light blue as opposed to the code, which has white and orange and yellow in it. So let's go ahead and put some notes here. And I'm going to typically write my notes into the code so that I can remember them. And if you do the same, or if you write yours by hand, you at least have an idea of what's been discussed or why we've written some type of code, right? So multi-line comments are contained in a let's do forward slash asterisk parent, right? And again, notice they are the reverse of each other. It's slash star star slash, right? And notice now I can just keep typing and it's still considered part of the comment. As long as it's between those two symbols, it's between the comments. We can write as many lines as we, and they are ignorant. And I say compiler instead of computer because what's going to happen is this code does nothing on its own, and no matter how much we write, and no matter how powerful it may seem like, until it's compiled or converted into the Java programming language. And so the idea, I'm sorry, not Java programming language, the machine language or the bytecode for the JVM, which is the system that will actually run our code. And so these things, the compiler, when it checks for errors, it doesn't look at comments. When it checks for correctness or for grammar or for syntax errors, it doesn't look at these things at all. And so we can write as much as we like between a multi-line comment and go from there, right? So now I'm going to show a second type of comment, a single line comment. Is by two forward slashes, right? A single line comment is preceded by two forward slashes. So the advantage of it, so why would you do one versus the other? One, because it's much easier to write two forward slashes quickly and write your note. They aren't single lines. As soon as I go to the next line, it is back to code. And so that's something we have to be careful with. The other advantage is that we can write a single line comment on a line with code and not hurt the code or get rid of it. So for example, I can put a note over here, and I can do the same thing, I guess, with a multi-line if I put the two symbols on the same line, but it's quick often to do something like this. Compiler must know what package this file is in, right? So we're saying the compiler must know which package this file is in, and so that's why we have this special line of code that says Java Basics, and there it is. It tells us the hello world is in the basics folder. Because we may know because we had the folder created and we can search our file explorer to look for it, but our directory system, but the reality is the compiler also needs to know where things are in relation to other files, and so one way of doing this is a package declaration, right? We may call this that. So I'm going to also put a note here, package declaration, right? We're declaring that we are in this package. Right? So again, convenient single line comments can be used all over the place, and we can use multi-line if you want to do that as well. I unfortunately tend to just write the double slash everywhere, so even if I write multiple lines, I still tend to just put double slashes, but that's totally a preference, and it doesn't really have an impact on anything. So we're going to continue, and so the one thing I'll point out is this is usually the only line outside of the curly braces of our class. We see this other keyword, or these other line, public class hello world, and then a set of curly braces. These curly braces are the core of all of our code for this particular file. And so the only lines that are really outside of it are the package declarations, and there might actually be more than one. We'll see later on that we do end up with multiple package declarations sometimes. But the end result is that everything else should be between curly braces, of course, except this first line, which tells us that we are in this class, and the name of this class must match the name of the file. So I'll kind of prove it by changing this to a lowercase w, And as soon as I do, you see there's an error, and if I read this error, and we're going to have to get comfortable reading errors, so as some of them are pretty solid, some of them are really weak, so we have to kind of do our best to interpret them. This one is pretty clear, right? Class hello world is public, should be declared in a file named hello world. It says, look, if you have a class called hello world with a lowercase w, your file name better have a lowercase w, but we know that we did it with the capital because we were following the standard. So this is not okay. I have two choices. Change the file name, change the word here. Changing the file name would break the standard, so we should probably not do it. We were allowed to do it. It won't destroy our code, but it's not good practice. So let's correct it for a capital W, right? So, and now everything is in our curly braces. And just to be clear, maybe let me go ahead and do this. Paint. Just so I can show you. If we're not clear about the terminology, I'm going to make it kind of explicit. Curly braces, right? There are three things that we should know for our language, and I'll use certain terminology. Parentheses, brackets, braces. Parentheses, hopefully everyone knows, are the nice curved things. Those are the most common in mathematics, and we'll be using parentheses all over the place in Java code. Brackets, what I call brackets, sometimes people call square brackets. Those are the ones that are straight. And if you look at your keyboard, they're typically up and to the left from the enter key. And those are also tied with the curly braces, which are shift brackets. So curly braces, you might have also heard them called braces. I'll sometimes just say braces. Sometimes you'll hear them called mustaches, which is kind of strange. You might hear them called curly brackets, but I tend not to do that because again, in my mind, brackets are the square ones. And I don't want to have to constantly, qualify with square or curly. Some people call them curlies, some people call them mustaches, some people call them alligators. I don't really get that one, but the idea is that there's a lot of names for them, but I will be using parentheses, right? Parentheses for the first ones, brackets, and braces. And I might say curly braces sometimes, but generally speaking, those are the three terms I'm going to use. So we should know those things. So our curly braces or our braces, our code, what we're going to start in, has to be inside of the class. Nothing else we do should be outside of these curly braces no matter what. And we might make more sets of curly braces that are nested or indented inward as part of the class. And that's going to happen a lot, but still everything else should fall within these original set of curly braces. Another nice thing that Netbeans does for us is it does highlight the pairings, so they're lined up, which is one great advantage, I think. And then as we write more, we can always check that we're not missing one or anything like that because they'll highlight each other, whatever pairing we choose. So now we're going to go ahead and begin with our first part. Every Java program must have a start in order for the program to know where to begin. The starting point is always the same for every Java program, no matter what. It doesn't matter if there are 10 lines, 1 line, 40 billion lines, whether there's 1 file, 20 files, 100 files, there's still one starting point to a Java program. And this is called the main function, right? And so we're going to write out this code. Initially, we're not going to know what all the words mean. Again, there's certain words that we may not be aware of yet, public and class. But we will eventually learn every single keyword and what they mean and what they do for us. But for this first step, since this is our kind of first simple program, we're going to just kind of write it out together and memorize it. And you should have it kind of burned into your brain at some point. So we're going to write public static void main, and then parentheses, capital string, and again, we'll talk about what all these words mean, and then a set of brackets, open and close, and then args, and then we're going to close our parentheses, and then I'm going to put an open and closed set of curly braces. So again, notice the class has a set, and then within the class, there is a public static void main declaration, and it itself has its own set of curly braces. And this is where I start to think where these alignments work out, because it's easy for me to spot who goes where. The indentation helps, and the alignment helps, in my opinion. The only thing that can change in this line is args. This is actually purely just a name, and it could be anything you want. It could be the word banana, and it would have no impact whatsoever. And so this is acceptable to put whatever you like, but args is typically the word we use, and it does stand for arguments, and maybe later on we'll talk about what that happens to mean, but for our purposes, we're not going to use it very often. So now to get our first program going, it's going to be a one-liner. It's going to be a beautiful, simple program. All we're going to do is print out the text hello world. Right? This is the traditional start to programming. And so in Java, we're used to visual programs, right? This isn't a giant window, and I have tons of different things that are windows, and that's what Windows is called, right? So, but the reality is that our programs, for the most part, are not going to be graphical in that sense. They're going to be only showing up in a console or command line area or terminal you might have heard if you've used a Mac or console, any of those things. or Linux. And so the idea is that our code is going to purely show up there, but because we're in Netbeans in an IDE, the console is not a loose program somewhere else. It's going to be built in, and that's what that output section was. If you still have it, and mine will pop up when I run it. So how do we make that text show up in that output area? We're going to use our special command. Again, this is one that we have to memorize for now, and we'll talk more about what it means as we go. It will be system.out.println, open parentheses, and then in quotes, in double quotes, we're going to put our message. And our message, at least for me, following the tradition, is the words hello world, right? And then we end it with a semicolon. So this is the beginning of our kind of learning of the grammar or syntax of our language. One of those things is statements, commands that happen, things that we tell the computer to do, typically end in semicolons. So this act of, hey, can you print out this message? Statement. It means ends in semicolon. It's kind of like a sentence with the period or exclamation point or question mark. We must end with a semicolon. Notice the class declaration did not, and the main declaration did not, but because those are not really statements, those are more of like structural layout things. The statement is print out this message, and that ends in a semicolon. I'm going to go ahead and save it by hitting Control S. And I know it's saved because this is not bold. If this was bold, then I would know it was unsaved, and that could cause a problem, so I saved it. And I'm going to run it. So now, there are a lot of different ways to run the file. The one I'm going to suggest is very simple, mainly because it allows us to have multiple mains inside of our project. And we're going to, if we stick with my strategy of all the notes in one class, we're going to have mains all over the place, right? Typically, you don't do that. But for our purposes, since we're not making some giant project, I think this might be a reasonable approach. If I press this play button near the top, this green play button, right, that would ask me, which main do you want to use? And it would remember it. And in this case, there's only one, but there could be a giant list of them. And then if I clicked OK, it would run that one. And then what happens is every time I press the play button, it would automatically run that one. So that's actually a pretty convenient thing to have. However, as we have more and more mains, and we want to run like a second or third one, we press play, it's going to remember the first one. And we'll have to go to some setting window to change that. So instead, I typically go with the approach of right-click, run file, or Shift F6. So you don't have to, it'll run whatever file you happen to be in. And if there's a main there, it'll work. So if there's no main, it won't work, but if there is one, it'll do it. So I'm going to right-click and click run file. We'll give it a moment to do some work. We can see in the bottom, it did stuff. That was the building of our program, and in the final result, this is our program. Run single, and then hello world. And it said it was successful, it did not crash, it ended in 1 second. And if I run it again, it should be a little bit faster as we go. Less stuff will happen, but there it is, hello world. And that's a pretty exciting thing for it to do. It has to build our code, compile it, and it even tells us it's compiling it, and then runs our program. Not a huge program, doesn't do a lot, but it is our first program, and that is a pretty big deal. I'm going to end the video now, and we will continue with more details of our language as we go. This was the starting point. I think you should be proud of yourself to get to this far. This is the opening kind of point in this class, and we will move quickly as we go along. And so you'll get better and better and be able to produce some interesting things very, very soon. I'll see you all in the next video.